Hey, welcome back. Chapter 3. Tutorial. If you desire to become a god, climb up the tower. You have now arrived at Floor 0, the tutorial hall. Swoosh. Yanwu frowned as the bright light pierced his eyes, making them tingle. His vision shook violently and he felt dizzy, as though he were on a high-altitude flight. Your trait, cold-blooded, has helped you maintain composure. He felt something wriggling inside his body, steadying the spinning world around him. The motion sickness soon subsided, and Yanwu could look around more comfortably. He found himself in a passage that ran straight ahead. The walls were made of rock, and the ceiling was studded with stones that glowed with light at regular intervals. However, the light was dim, and he could only see 2 meters ahead of him, and the rest of the way was dark. I'm really in. Yanwu clenched his fists. He'd seen the same scene in the diary. The tower served as a gateway and as a test to assess participants who wished to become a god. The tower didn't accept just any player, so candidates had to prove that they were worthy. The tutorial location where players were tested was often called Floor 0. The people who hurt Zhongwu are just past this place. Just by closing his eyes, Yanwu could recall the scenes from the diary and picture the faces of those who had betrayed his brother and driven him to his death. However, he didn't get agitated and kept his head as cool as possible. Just wait a little while longer. I'll be there soon. To enter the tower, he had to pass the tutorial with a high score, and not just any high score. It must be so high that I'll be in first place. Of course, it wasn't going to be easy. The tower was connected to numerous dimensions, spaces, and worlds. Only the most capable could participate as players. Yanwu could only be considered a strong candidate among those from Earth. After all, the universe was vast, and there were many other candidates. Compared to the other players, Yanwu had many weaknesses, since he focused only on physical abilities and instinctual skills. He would be dead without even taking a few steps in the tutorial. However, the tutorial is also the place where I can obtain the qualification. His brother had possessed a very weak body before he'd started climbing the tower. However, he'd still passed the tutorial and even reached 6th place in the rankings in the shortest amount of time ever. The tutorial didn't only test physical abilities. It also assessed other aspects, such as players' talent, judgment, agility, resourcefulness, and decisiveness. It rated the players after summing up all of these aspects. Of course, there were always deaths during the process. Many candidates were overconfident in their insignificant abilities and rushed into the tutorial heedlessly, only to end up dead. Fortunately, Yanwu was aware of the dangers of the tutorial as well as its value. Hidden pieces can be found everywhere. I have to gather as many of them as possible to finalize my incomplete succession. Yanwu's status window was displaying incomplete dragon body, 5%, and his brother's achievements had not entirely passed to him yet. Yanwu intended to refine his vessel as much as possible in order to replace the word incomplete with complete. I'm going to focus on making my vessel as complete as possible for now. After organizing his thoughts, Yanwu quietly took a white mask out of his bag and put it on his face. He would have to face a lot of people, so he covered his face in preparation before he began walking slowly along the passage. He didn't know how long he'd been walking when a blue glow suddenly appeared in the air. Oh-hyo! A guest at a time like this? I almost missed you and let you pass. A portal opened, and someone dropped down from it. In an instant, Yanwu instinctively stepped back and took a combat stance, crossing 2 daggers in front of his chest. The stranger's appearance was bizarre. It was short and only reached to his waist, and it had bumpy, scabrous skin. It had long, slanted eyes and glistening fangs that poked out of its thick lips. The mere sight of the creature filled him with disgust. It was a monster called a goblin. However, it had a different demeanor from the goblins he'd seen in the diary. Unlike ordinary goblins with low intelligence who only followed their instincts, The goblin in front of him wore a strange monocle over one eye and a fancy-looking tuxedo. His polite behavior gave him a dignified air. "Despite my easygoing nature, your behavior hurts my feelings. So, why don't you put down your daggers?" In contrast to his words, the goblin smiled in delight and winked. Only then did Yan Wu realize who the goblin was. He was one of the guardians who managed and oversaw each floor and trial in the tower. "Greetings. I am the guardian of Floor 0, Ivilka. It's our destiny to meet like us. Why don't you give us a round of applause?" "Oh, hyo. Yan Wu lowered his daggers. The guardians belonged to the tower and were responsible for leading the players throughout the trials. There was no reason to be wary. "Ho, you trust me? That's because it's good to keep a guardian's advice in mind, even if it seems trivial. Oh my, I guess you know a little bit about us. Since you're wearing a mask, I thought you were shy. Anyway, it should be much easier to talk now." Ivilka began explaining with some light jokes. The tutorial is divided into 7 sections, from A to F. Each section has a different environment and a different challenge. You will be scored according to how you perform the challenges within a restricted amount of time. At the end of the tutorial, all your scores will be added up and the results will be announced. Yan Wu already had a rough idea of the rules thanks to the diary, but to avoid suspicion and confirm his information, he asked, "Do I have to pass all 7 sections?" "Not quite. You simply need to prove you possess the minimum qualifications in the tutorial. If you think your score is high enough, you can simply stop. Of course, it's good to pass every trial to get a higher score." "What are the benefits of getting a higher score?" "Players are given rewards according to their score. After all, shouldn't there be some motivation for players to get better results? The Tower and the Guardians are very thorough in that regard, ohio. How long does the tutorial last?" "Players have 30 days. It's up to you to allocate the time for each section. However," Ivilka smiled as he adjusted his monocle, "this round started a week ago, and there are only 3 weeks left. What do you want to do? Do you want to wait until the next round?" On the surface, a week didn't seem like a long time, but it was already 1/4 of the whole tutorial period. The front-runners have already used this time to run far ahead, and perhaps latecomers won't be able to catch up at all. The higher the score, the better the reward, and the better the chances of passing the tutorial. Since Yan Wu was planning to achieve a lot in the tutorial, it was a very disadvantageous start. However, a slight smile appeared on his lips. "That's what I was expecting anyway." Ivilki was indifferent to his reaction and continued explaining. "Although this place is called a tutorial, it's still quite difficult. We usually advise players to organize a party of 3 to 5 people when going through each section. It increases the chances of proceeding smoothly. That means I get a higher score if I pass a section alone, right?" "Yes, but it will be much harder. If a late individual player catches up with the leading parties, are there any benefits?" Ivilka's eyes glittered as he realized what Yan Wu was thinking. He smiled broadly, making his fangs stand out even more. "The tower grows according to the player's achievements. The score will be adjusted according to a player's individual achievements, so you don't have to worry about that." Understood. Now that he'd confirmed everything, Yan Wu started to warm up lightly. "Crack! No matter what, I must kill that guy. If I don't, it will mess up the whole plan." Yan Wu recalled the most important hidden piece that could only be obtained in the tutorial, the guy who only appeared during certain periods of time. Killing him would make the succession process easier. Crunch. Crack. His muscles began to tighten, his blood circulated faster, and his mind grew lucid. Ivilka took a step back. He had already noticed that Yan Wu wasn't likely to listen to any more advice. There had been players like him before, and they ended up facing one of 2 possibilities: rushing forward overconfidently, only to get fucked, or doing something that was truly a sight to behold. Either way, Ivilka thought it would be fun to watch, so he did not stop Yan Wu. if that's what you want. Snap. Ivilka lightly flicked his fingers, making a huge panel appear in the air. Beginning the trial of Floor 0. Trial. You, a participant who aims to become a god, must prove yourself worthy of climbing the tower. Within the time limit, you must pass through 7 gates and 7 challenges. Requirement. Achieve a high score within the time limit. Let the trial begin. Ivilka said goodbye with a dignified look as he disappeared like the wind. A timer appeared in his place. Theme 37, 88, 96, 49, 37, 88, 95. There are about 22 days and 21 hours remaining. Yan Wu clenched his dagger and stepped forward. Let's do this. A new message popped up as he crossed the line dividing the starting zone from Section A. You have entered Section A. Either break through or deactivate all the traps in this section. There was another straight passage ahead, and he felt like the darkness was beckoning him. Yan Wu carefully took a step forward, keeping his senses alert. However, nothing happened even after a considerable amount of time passed, as though there were nothing there at all. An ordinary person would have relaxed, but the farther Yan Wu went, the warier he became. Ivilka said it would be easier to pass through in small teams, and if this advice was accurate, then he shouldn't underestimate the potential danger. After all, it always appeared without any notice, wiping out everything like a raging storm. Like right now. Swish! An arrow shot across the darkness, and Yan Wu instinctively turned his body aside. The arrow brushed past his left forearm, leaving behind a scorching pain. His clothes were torn and blood splashed. Twang. A steel arrow! He came back to his senses, frowning at the arrow with the metal shaft that was deeply embedded into the wall. It would have torn off his arm if it had managed to hit him. He would be dead by now if it had hit his head or abdomen. The diary had warned him about the various traps in Section A, however. The location of each trap changed each time, and they were randomly activated, so his brother's experiences weren't of much help. All he could do was stay alert and find his way through. Swish! 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 More steel arrows flew towards him one after the other, all from different directions. It was impossible to track them. Yan Wu crouched low and rolled forward, grabbing his backpack. It was thick and filled with clothing and equipment, so he could use it as a shield, which was why he had brought it in the first place. Puck! 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 3 steel arrows struck his backpack with such strong impact that it felt as though his arm would come off each time an arrow hit. 2 managed to fully pierce through the backpack, their tips poking out as if they were showing their faces shyly. He managed to straighten himself up and stuck closely to a wall. Since he didn't know where the attacks were coming from, he had to decrease his exposure as much as possible, something that he'd learned the hard way. However, some traps had also been set up behind and below him. Snicked! Before he even realized what was happening, an arrow had pierced deep into his left thigh. Ugh! Yan Wu felt as though fireworks were exploding right in front of his eyes. He gritted his teeth and tried turning around despite the terrible pain. Puck! 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 Once again, arrows ripped through his backpack. This time, they penetrated his left shoulder, forearm, and ribs. A fierce pain is overwhelming you. You have been afflicted with stun. Your trait, cold-blooded, has helped you maintain composure. The status, stun, has been removed. You have developed resistance to pain. He felt as if his arm had been torn off and he couldn't breathe. However, Yan Wu was familiar with this sensation, and he gritted his teeth and held tightly onto consciousness. He had suffered this kind of pain many times in Africa. He'd been shot, and his life had been in danger many times. This pain was nothing in comparison. He quickly checked his condition. My left shoulder and forearm have gotten direct hits, but the arrow only grazed my ribs. The wounds look bad, but I can still move. He made a decision and lifted his ragged backpack, stepping back as quickly as he could. It looks like the traps were activated at the same time when I passed through a certain point. That meant the traps were concentrated in one area. He had to run until he passed it. Even as he retreated, the steel arrows kept flying towards him. At first, there were only 1 or 2 arrows, but after a certain point, 4 or 5 started to fly out at the same time. He tried to avoid exposing himself as much as possible as he moved. A trail of blood spread from his wounds and stained the wall. 2 more steel arrows struck his calf. Soon, he reached a certain zone, and the steel arrows no longer rained down on him. Yan Wu leaned against the wall as he threw the backpack bristling with steel arrows on the floor. Everything was spinning around him, and an unpleasant, stuffy taste lingered in his mouth. Your wounds are bleeding severely. You have been afflicted with stun. Your trait, cold-blooded, has helped you maintain composure. The status stun has been removed. You have developed resistance to bleeding. Yan Wu barely managed to hold on to consciousness. It was almost by instinct that he managed to reach the safe zone, but if he lost consciousness here, he would die instantly. Yan Wu plunged his hand into the torn backpack. Its contents had spilled onto the floor, and items rolled around. Fortunately, he hadn't lost his first aid kit, and he quickly found it. Yan Wu opened the kit and took out disinfectant, bandages, a threaded needle, an oil-soaked cotton ball, and a lighter. Because he could hardly move his left arm, it took him a long time to find them all. As soon as he finished his preparations, Yan Wu put his hand on the steel arrow stuck in his left shoulder and pulled it out. Ugh! As expected, he felt a fierce pain as though his arm were about to fall off. The hand holding the steel arrow trembled, and blood gushed out from his wound. With bloodshot eyes, Yan Wu set the cotton ball on fire and pressed it against his wound. Hiss! The smell of burned flesh filled the air. Your skin has been set on fire. You have been afflicted with stun. Your trait, cold-blooded, has helped you maintain composure. The status stun has been removed. You have developed resistance to burning. The wound healed quickly, and soon it was only a scar. Yan Wu repeated the process with the arrow in his leg. Then he applied disinfectant. Thankfully, none of his bones were broken thanks to his quick reflexes. However, he could barely catch his breath after treating all of his wounds. Ha! 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 His strength drained from his body, and his left arm and leg felt particularly weak. Such a rough start. This is nuts. Yan Wu was so dumbfounded that he wanted to curse himself. He knew it would be dangerous, but he hadn't thought it would be this bad. There was such a big difference between knowing a fact and experiencing it for real. I'm glad I have this trait. Yan Wu felt grateful that he could stay rational in any situation. He'd always been mentally strong, but now he felt even stronger since he could make snap decisions even in dangerous situations like this. In addition, the resistance he was building up helped relieve his pain little by little. He wasn't sure how the system worked and didn't know whether his trait was being enhanced or his body was slowly adapting. The only thing he knew for sure was that the developments were helpful. He quickly composed himself and looked at the passage still shadowed in darkness. It gaped like the ferocious jaws of a beast, but even beasts had weaknesses. There's a specific timing for each arrow. There is also a subtle signal. Yan Wu narrowed his eyes. I have to figure out the timing. The traps had to be a combination of multiple devices. Sensors captured someone approaching, cogwheels spun to measure direction, and finally, the loaded steel arrows were shot out. Because of the darkness, it is impossible to see the steel arrows coming. But since the cogwheels activate before they're let loose, I need to listen to the sound of the cogwheels spinning. It's the only way I can find the location and direction of the steel arrows. However, it likely only took a few seconds for the cogwheels to spin, and then the steel arrows to be fired. The sound it made was also very soft. However, that brief moment was all he had to find the trap's location. Perhaps it was a simple process, but it was impossible to execute without very fine senses and reflexes. Luckily, Yan Wu had something to rely on. I have sense-strengthening skills. With his new control over his 5 senses, he would be able to track the sound. The players had all been given basic skills that suited them so that they could overcome the challenges. After all, the trick was to use the skills well. Yan Wu closed his eyes and focused on the sounds around him. It wasn't too hard to concentrate since he was used to it. Sense strengthening has been activated. Your auditory sense has been enhanced. Sense strengthening skill level has risen. 0. 8%. Yan Wu tried to concentrate on all the tiny sounds, but it was difficult to isolate and identify one sound among the different noises. Plop, plop. He heard water dripping from the ceiling. Rattle, clink. He heard the soft sound of steel arrows being loaded into the traps. He also heard a lot of other noises in the passage, picking through each one slowly. A long time passed. Then he heard a squeaky sound that seemed to come from a rusty object. Creak. That's it. It was definitely a cogwheel. Yan Wu opened his eyes and threw one of his daggers to the side. Puck. Crunch. The dagger struck deep into the ceiling, and soon a broken mechanical device and steel arrows fell. Yes, I can find them. Yan Wu's eyes sparkled. Although there were downsides to reducing his other senses and only focusing on hearing, the important thing was that he now had a way to go through the passage. Yan Wu forced his creaking body up. His body still screamed in pain. He could barely move his left arm, and he limped as he walked. It was crazy to move in such a state. However, despite his slow steps, Yan Wu managed to get to the place where the next trap had been set up. Swish! Steel arrows shot out once again. Right shoulder. Yan Wu had already heard the sound of a cogwheel and turned his body sideways, measuring the direction of the trap and the trajectory of the arrow. Puck! The steel arrow narrowly missed his shoulder and embedded into the wall. Yes! Yan Wu clenched his fists. Sense-strengthening skill proficiency has increased. 5%. Certain that his plan would work, Yan Wu did not delay any further and moved on to the next spot. Swish, 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 swish. 4. Each arrow was aiming for a different body part, his temple, heart, abdomen, and knee. Yan Wu dodged, turning his head to the side and taking a step forward at the same time. The arrow aiming for his thigh flew past his leg and struck the floor. At the same time, he used the flat of his dagger blade to block the arrow streaking towards his abdomen. Clang! The dagger trembled, producing a melodious sound. His hand was hurting from the impact, but the thrill filled him with adrenaline. Sense-strengthening skill proficiency has increased. 2%. Your strength has increased by 1 point. Your dexterity has increased by 1 point. The messages notifying him of the increase of his skill level and attribute points filled his vision. If my strength and dexterity have increased, then status window. Player, Yan Wu Cha. Trait, cold-blooded. Strength, 11 dexterity. 16. Health, 12 magic power. 21. Skills, draconic eyes, 0%. Sense strengthening, 2.1%. Precognition, 0%, just as I thought. Yan Wu had a satisfied smile on his face. It took a considerable amount of time and training to boost one's ability in the real world, but it was different in this place. I can gain achievements as long as I exert myself. There can't be any other place like this. The interface system had enabled his brother's fast growth, and Yan Wu closed the status window to calmly judge the situation. It should be possible to dodge the arrows, but my reflexes are still too slow. His dagger was half a beat too slow to block the arrows, and so it didn't matter even if he noticed them coming. Yan Wu sent part of his consciousness, which had been solely focused on hearing, into his right hand. Sense strengthening has been activated. Your haptic sense has been enhanced. Sense strengthening skill proficiency has increased. 2, 3%. Yan Wu took another step forward. Swish! An arrow shot towards his forehead, and he quickly struck it aside at a comfortable speed. I only need to focus on my hearing and right arm, but it's hard to split my senses in two at the same time. He gazed at the darkness. I need to move slowly, but not by too much. Yan Wu began to proceed slowly once again. Swish, swish, swish. With each step, steel arrows rained down on him. Yan Wu avoided them with minimal movements or cut their trajectories short with his dagger if he couldn't dodge them. Next, he refined his blocking technique a little more, deflecting arrows with the flat of his dagger or ducking to avoid them. He also twisted sideways or walked forward to block them. Puck! He missed an arrow which struck his back, but he pulled it indifferently out without a single groan. After staunching the blood, he limped forward like an unstoppable machine. Sense strengthening skill proficiency has increased. 3, 1%. Your strength has increased by 1 point. Your health has increased by 1 point. After he'd been walking for a long time, Yan Wu noticed that the traps followed a certain pattern. The attribute points are given according to how I deal with the arrows. For example, if he struck a steel arrow, his strength rose. If he dodged, his dexterity rose. And if he was hit, his health rose. Of course, he couldn't be sure that this was the exact pattern, but he considered it to be so as his stats raised differently according to how he dealt with each arrow. Colored arrowheads are also mixed in with the other arrows. As his stats rose, he grew more sensitive, and soon he could actually see the arrows. At first, he thought he'd been mistaken about the colors since the light was so dim, and it was hard to observe all the arrows at the same time as they rushed towards him from different directions. Also, aside from the colors, the arrowheads were similar, which made him doubt his judgment. However, as his vision strengthened and his ability to see moving objects increased, his suspicion gradually turned into certainty. Some of the arrowheads were definitely colored. What have I seen so far? Red, blue, and yellow? Yan Wu was lost in thought. What on earth does it mean? Why do they have different colors? Then he remembered something from the diary. Now that I think of it, everything in the tutorial is there for a reason, even the smallest little thing. Everything has a significance. The strangest thing is the colors painted on the arrowheads. Zhong Wu didn't know the secret of the arrowheads either. Is it some kind of hidden piece? His brother had barely passed Section A with his teammates, but Yan Wu was going through it on his own. This difference seemed to be helping him find the hidden piece that no one had found before. Yan Wu resumed moving, thinking he should test his theories. Swish! Just in time, one of the 6 arrows that hurtled towards him had a blue arrowhead. I can check my attributes and skills if this is the case. Yan Wu avoided all the other arrows and struck the blue one. Clang! Your strength has increased by 1 point. Sense strengthening skill proficiency has increased. 4, 2%. Messages informing him about the rise in his strength and skill proficiency appeared. His action hadn't been ineffective, but Yan Wu shook his head. This isn't it. There must be something else. There's a reason they're different from the other arrows. After a long time, another colored arrow rushed out. This time, it was red. Yan Wu turned around and dodged all the arrows except for the red one, which he parried. He could feel a twinge in his wrist and realized it was heavier than the others. You have blocked a red arrow. Your strength has increased by 3 points. This is it. Yan Wu grew serious. It was a noticeable increase in strength. Status window. Player, Yan Wu Cha. Trait, cold-blooded. Strength, 19. Dexterity, 19. Health, 14. Magic power, 21. Skills, draconic eyes, 0%. Sense strengthening, 4.3%. Precognition, 0%. Yan Wu smiled faintly. As time passed, the rate at which his attributes' points increases had slowed little by little, but he had found a way to increase the points significantly once again. Each color must be related to a different attribute. Red is strength. Then, what about the other ones? When he blocked the blue arrow, nothing happened. It was clear that each color required a different response. As soon as Yanwu realized this, his progress grew faster. Swish! The blue arrow was faster than the others, and this time, instead of striking it, he dodged it. You have dodged a blue arrow. Your dexterity has increased by 2 points. The yellow arrow was sharper. Because striking and dodging applied to the other colors, he put out his left arm to see what would happen. Puck! You have been hit by a yellow arrow. Your health has increased by 2 points. This is crazy. Yanwu had barely managed to pull out part of the arrow before his expression turned into a frown due to the pain. He felt as though his arm were falling off. He had suppressed the nerves in charge of transmitting pain as much as possible and only got a flesh wound, but it was clearly something a normal person wouldn't do. He started feeling dizzy from blood loss again, but he managed to barely hold it together thanks to his increased health. Without it, he would have already fallen. Then, Yanwu coughed out a mouthful of blood. It dripped down from his hand, which covered his mouth. Suppressing his nerves didn't make the injuries go away, and the pain still continued to spread from his left arm to the rest of his body. He retched, feeling like he was about to pass out. His body was warning him that he wouldn't be able to endure any longer, and that if he didn't rest right away, he would collapse. Yanwu, however, gritted his teeth again. This pain is nothing compared to what Zhongwu went through. Even though Yanwu had not experienced it himself, he was aware of the pain his brother had suffered from watching the recorded images in the diary over and over. If he couldn't withstand this, there was nothing he could do for his brother in the future. Yanwu forcefully pulled the yellow arrow out of his left arm. His body had already reached its limit, but he had achieved his goal. Red is strength, blue is dexterity, yellow is health. He only needed to react to each color appropriately. There was still a long way to go before the end of the passage, and his senses told him that there were still lots of traps left, which meant that he could earn more attribute points. Blood pooled under his tongue, but Yanwu swallowed it back and began moving forward one tottering step at a time, his eyes blazing like flames. Oh, yo. He is truly an amazing candidate. I don't think I've ever seen such a character. Thousands of screens floated in several rows in front of the Guardian Evilke, showing all the players currently participating in the tutorial. They all had different appearances. However, Evilke's eyes were fixed only on one screen in a corner, where Yanwu trudged down a passage as if he were about to fall over any moment. I never expected him to be such an eye-catching individual. In fact, there were plenty of other, more striking candidates. The siblings from the Cheongram family, the most anticipated participants from the One-Horn tribe, the dumbass duo aiming to become high rankers, and a swordsman of Marcusian descent. They were all strong enough that if they started climbing the tower straight away, they wouldn't fall behind. They had already entered Section E and were carrying out missions. Some of them were already reaching Section F. It was hard to tell who would get the highest score in the tutorial, but Evilke's eyes were oddly fixed on Yanwu, who had been struggling in Section A for days. When he'd first seen Yanwu, he thought Yanwu would be dead after a few steps. Instead of fucking up, the little fucker without any ability completely exceeded his expectations. Many struggled to pass Section A even if they formed teams, but Yanwu not only made progress on his own, he even found the hidden piece in the arrowheads, and he was using them to steadily increase his stats through his iron will, even though he looked like he was on the verge of collapse. This guy is the real deal. After being a guardian for such a long time, Evilke could sense this in his gut. The frontrunners were also great, but this was the guy who would turn the entire tutorial on its head. There are still a lot of dangers ahead even if he manages to break through this section, but if he can pass the other sections as well as he is doing right now. Evilke adjusted his monocle. Yanwu was already reaching the last part of Section A. I think this round of the tutorial will be a lot of fun. Oh hyo hyo hyo. Player Yanwu Cha. Trait, cold-blooded. Strength, 20 INI. Dexterity, 33. Health, 30. Magic power, 21. Skills. Draconic eyes, 0%. Sense strengthening, 8.3%. Precognition, 0%. As he walked down the passage, Yanwu checked his status window and clenched his fists. All the attributes except for magic power have risen. He had earned a total of 55 attribute points. In order to raise one's attribute points, one has to train regularly or push past the limit. Even though I'm a solo player, this should be a decent number of achievements for one day. Actually, it was not just decent, it was great. None of the other players had improved their attribute points by so much in such a short amount of time. It's not just this. My muscle strength, mobility, endurance, explosive power, and general power have all improved. It had been a physically difficult task, but he was satisfied with the results. He was a little disappointed that he couldn't increase his magic power, but he shrugged the thought off since he didn't feel like he had a need for it right now. Yanwu pushed the iron gate in front of him with a slight smile. Creak. You have reached the arrival point. Your wounds will be healed. Yanwu was beyond exhausted, covered in blood, and there were even a couple of arrows embedded in his flesh that he hadn't pulled out yet. His head was burning from focusing too much on his senses. He didn't know what other traps were waiting beyond the iron gate, but he still stepped through. However, all he could see was a room about 33 square meters in size. Whoosh! A swarm of white lights rose along the bloody wounds, which were already leaking pus. The wounds started to heal slowly, and the pus disappeared. Energy was also filling his worn-out body. The base was designed to allow players who were injured and tired from Section A to recuperate. Yanwu felt both relieved that he could catch his breath and satisfied that he had improved to this level. Snore. He fell asleep without even realizing it. Did I fall asleep? Yanwu's body felt stiff. Just as the diary said, the arrival point gave players a chance to recover, and when he'd noticed his wounds being healed, he felt so relieved that he wanted to nap for a short while. But it seemed like he'd slept longer than he intended, and he opened his eyes to check the time. Peekaboo! Suddenly, a man whose face was hidden under a hooded robe waved his hand at Yanwu. Yanwu was so surprised that he shot up and jumped backward. He quickly brought his hand to his waist, cold sweat running down his back. What kind of person is this man? How come I never noticed there was someone next to me? His sense-strengthening skill was active and had scanned the room, but this guy managed to avoid it as if he weren't part of the world. At that moment, information from the diary rushed into his mind. Occasionally, merchants pop up at the arrival point to sell items that players need, ranging from ordinary food and potions to skill books and artifacts. A mysterious merchant? Ho, ho! The man in the robe let out a chuckle and clapped his hands. The space behind him distorted, revealing shelves stocked with miscellaneous items. I'm glad you know who I am. Salutations, my lovable customer. I am a passing merchant. Yanwu didn't know what to make of this mysterious merchant. He had just said peekaboo and gullible. He couldn't read the merchant's expression because of the fabric shrouding his face, but the merchant seemed to be enjoying the situation. Yanwu knitted his forehead. I've been too complacent. Like the Guardians, the mysterious merchant was forbidden from interfering with the players, which was why he hadn't hurt Yanwu. But even though I was exhausted, I shouldn't have slept like that. February 20, 1953. Yanwu checked the time and saw that 12 hours had passed since he arrived at the base. It had taken him about a day and 10 hours to get through the first half of Section A. In total, approximately 46 hours had passed since he'd arrived at the tutorial. It was pretty fast for a solo player, and it was evident why he was so exhausted. He'd powered through the first section even though he'd been on the verge of collapsing. However, Yanwu didn't like his situation. He knew that sufficient rest was required after any intensive training to allow for growth, since the human body wasn't a machine. In fact, even machines needed plenty of rest to avoid overheating. But Yanwu couldn't afford that right now. The tower was no less than a battlefield, and on a battlefield there was no room for rest at all. He had to be wary of enemies that could arrive from anywhere at any time. Even though there weren't any steel arrows in the arrival point, it was a place that other players could freely enter. Even though he was safe with the mysterious merchant, he couldn't say the same about the other players, even if I was too exhausted. Yanwu gathered his thoughts. He had to admit that he'd grown dull after being away from the battlefield for some time. He decided to sharpen himself and revert back to who he'd once been, Cain. Yanwu opened his eyes as he thought of his old code name, which he no longer used. His eyes shimmered with cold determination. A strange expression appeared on the mysterious merchant's face, although it was obscured by his clothing. He seemed to notice a big change in Yanwu's attitude after some mental struggle. He asked with a light smile, "On your way here, did you discover that you needed something, sir? I'm a merchant who sells everything. If you need something, just name it. Need any artifacts or slaves? I've got information too. I'll sell them at a good price." The mysterious merchant flicked his finger lightly, and a window popped up in front of Yanwu, showing the items he had for sale, which were divided into different categories. Yanwu lightly clucked his tongue as he touched the window. Medusa's venom, horn of the golden mountain goat, left eye of Tiamat, and nightmare of Walpurgis, too. He sells these kinds of items in the tutorial. This is insane. The items at the top of the list were ones that rankers would fervently pounce on at the upper floors of the tower. The list had items that could easily help someone complete the tutorial, but they were out of reach. There was no way that anyone going through the tutorial would be able to afford any of them. However, as he scrolled down, he found cheaper items, some of them good for beginners. Arhan-style swordsmanship manual, introduction to one-circle magic, and success formula to elemental sorcery. These skill books might come in handy, but they require some effort to attain proficiency. In particular, a dagger called the Venomous Fang of Barma grabbed Yanwu's attention. Venomous Fang of Barma. Attack power, 25. A dagger made from smelting the fangs of a serpent that inhabits the swamps of Barma. Poison has been applied to the edge of the dagger. The poison's effect is random. It's a dagger that inflicts curses, not poison. The weapon cursed its targets as soon as it touched them. There were different types of curses: poison, burn, freeze, electrocution, hallucination, stun, blind, and so on. The curse was unpredictable. If the target couldn't find a way to resist the random curse, they could be taken down. Moreover, since it was made from the fangs of a magical creature, he could continue using it even after reaching the upper floors of the tower. If he bought it, he would be able to put it to good use. However, Yanwu took his eyes off the dagger and moved on to the next items. It would be good to have it, but right now I need to focus on physical training. There's no need to rely on artifacts yet. A long time passed as he browsed through the list. Finally, he came to a stop. Found it. Reset ticket. You can return to any place you desire. Yanwu looked at the mysterious merchant with a grin. How much is this? We are conscientious merchants who only offer reasonable prices. We never overcharge players for items they need. We don't rip off those who don't have money. Make it brief. Your attribute points. That's all you have to pay. Conscientious merchants? Yanwu placed his hand on the mineral water at the bottom of the list. Mineral water, a bottle of drinking water to slake your thirst. Be sure to bring some with you. Price. Strength, 2 water costs 2 strength points. Conscientious? Yunwu was so dumbfounded that he burst out laughing. Of course, he could just ignore the water and not buy it, but humans needed water to live, and there was no other way to find drinking water or food during the tutorial. 3 dexterity points for 1 day's worth of food. Even if someone brought enough food and water from outside, it might be lost along the way, or even be stolen by other players. Also, players who barely managed to get through Section A often found themselves in need of better equipment. There's a boss room beyond this point, so players have no choice but to equip themselves for the fight. Players had to bite the bullet and buy items from the mysterious merchant, but then, with their decreased attribute points, the next fight would be even tougher. Then, they would have to trade the attribute points they'd scraped together to buy the next set of equipment, throwing themselves into a vicious cycle. And here he is, calling himself a conscientious merchant. He's no better than a thief. Yunwu smirked a little. I don't know who designed the tutorial, but they are truly evil. After closing the category window, Yunwu said, "There's something I want to buy." "Yes, say it. In exchange for all the attribute points I got from Section A, I'd like to buy tickets to reset Section A." The rules didn't allow players to attempt a section once more after clearing it, but since the ticket could send a player back to any location, a plan sprang into his mind. If he could stack up attribute points by repeatedly going through Section A, it would become much easier to proceed to the rest of the sections. For a brief moment, the mysterious merchant's eyes gave off a strange glow. They were filled with interest. "Do you mean the reset tickets?" "Yes. I do have those, but I've never met anyone interested in them. Usually, players who survive Section A ask for things that can make the next section easier for them, not something that will make them go through Section A all over again." "Well, I have something in mind, if you say so." The mysterious merchant chuckled and then clapped his hands, making the shelves behind him disappear. Attribute points acquired through Section A will be paid in exchange for the purchase. You have acquired reset ticket for Section AX10. Yunwu felt his body deflating like a balloon. The battle-hardened body he had developed seemed to be a dream, and he found 10 pink tickets in his hand. "It's easy to use the tickets. Just tear off a ticket whenever you want, and you'll be teleported to the location you desire." Yunwu shoved the tickets into his pocket. "I'll use it well. I'd appreciate it if you do. I must be off. I hope we meet again." The mysterious merchant turned and melted away without a trace. The room also started to disappear like a wave, and Yunwu found himself in a different place. Unlike the empty passage he'd gone through, this one had dozens of scarecrows standing in a row. There were also some players in the distance. 5 people were blasting away with all kinds of skills, fighting the scarecrows. He could hear their screams of anger. It was clear that the scarecrows weren't easy to handle. "This is Section A's boss room. Do you want to enter?" Yunwu took out a ticket. He wanted to experience the difficulty of the boss, but with his current condition, he would become toast with just one mistake. He tore the ticket without any hesitation. Whoosh. He opened his eyes and found himself in a familiar place. It was the starting zone of Section A. He drew a dagger from his waist and held it in his right hand. I must raise my attribute points as high as possible here. This time he intended to make Section A entirely his own.
To be continued,